In June 1940, German soldiers were moving across Europe, confident in their mission. They had been told that Britain was a place of chaos, where civilians hated each other and soldiers lived only to kill. Nazi propaganda painted the island as a harsh, cruel land, full of threats at every turn. Soldiers carried these images with them, imagining the horrors that awaited if they were ever captured. The stories they heard were consistent. British soldiers were described as brutal, merciless, and untrustworthy. Civilians were said to be suspicious and hostile. Anyone caught on British soil was expected to face harsh punishment, starvation, or even immediate execution. The propaganda emphasized fear. It gave no room for doubt, no chance to imagine anything else. Soldiers memorized these warnings. They repeated them to each other. They carried them like armor. For the German soldier in 1940, these ideas were more than news. They were reality. The men had grown up in a society that demanded obedience. Their teachers, newspapers, and radio broadcasts all reinforced the same vision of the enemy. Britain was a dark, frightening place. Every story reinforced the certainty that being captured there would be unbearable. When the soldiers were eventually taken prisoner, this certainty traveled with them. Capture did not mean relief, it meant horror. They were surrounded by their comrades, all of whom whispered the same warnings. They imagined the journey ahead. The capture itself often came after battle. Some soldiers were wounded, others were disoriented. Some had surrendered in small groups, others were part of larger units. In every case, fear was immediate and intense. Soldiers clutched their weapons, unsure if surrender would save them or if it would make them targets. They did not yet know that surrendering was not the end. It was only the beginning of a different kind of uncertainty. From the moment of capture, transport began. Soldiers were moved in crowded trucks or packed trains. Sometimes they walked long distances under guard. The journey was tense. Each man imagined the worst. They whispered rumors, and each rumor intensified their anxiety. They believed that at any moment they might face violence. They believed the guards would be cruel. They believed the food would be scarce, the beds filthy, the air full of danger. They had no reason to think otherwise. These were the expectations drilled into them by years of propaganda. As they crossed the English Channel, the sea added another layer of unease. Waves rose and fell beneath the ships. Soldiers gripped railings and ropes, watching the dark water. Some had never traveled by sea. The German soldiers had very little personal knowledge of Britain. Few had ever seen the countryside, the towns, or the cities. Their only knowledge came from official stories, propaganda films, and conversations with other soldiers. Every piece of information was filtered through fear. They believed that Britain was a place without warmth, without compassion, and without humanity. In their minds, captivity would not just be inconvenient, it would be terrifying. Some soldiers tried to prepare mentally. They made plans to resist, to escape, to endure any punishment. They imagined themselves as strong, disciplined, able to survive whatever horror awaited them. But deep down, the certainty of fear was stronger than any plan. They could not imagine kindness. They could not imagine calm. They could not imagine anything other than the stories they had been told. On arrival at ports or railway stations in Britain, the tension reached its peak. Soldiers were moved from ships to trains, often without much information about their destination. They were surrounded by British officers and guards, most of whom did not speak German. The silence of the guards, the lack of explanation, only intensified the fear. Every glance, every order, every sound of boots on gravel became a signal of potential danger. Soldiers tried. During this time, small rumors and conversations among the prisoners themselves often reinforced the terror. Stories of previous prisoners' suffering circulated. Some soldiers recalled what they had seen in news reports or heard in the military. Others made up their own tales, imagining the worst. Together, these stories created a mental landscape of fear, a shared expectation of suffering and danger. The men relied on each other to interpret what was happening, but every shared story seemed to increase their anxiety. They were trapped in a cycle of expectation, where every detail of the journey reinforced the fear they carried. Some soldiers tried to distract themselves. They counted the miles. They observed the countryside through train windows. But the eyes of guards, the rhythm of footsteps, and the quiet of the journey kept them alert. The mind cannot easily turn away from fear when it has been built over years. Soldiers remembered the warnings from home, the words of officers, the propaganda films, and the newspapers. Each memory felt real, as if it were proof of what would happen when they arrived. As they approached the camps, their anticipation grew. Soldiers began to imagine the fences, the loud commands, the harsh labor, and the constant vigilance they expect. Finally, they arrived at the camp gates. Guards in uniform stood silently. The fences were tall, the gates were closed. Soldiers were ordered to disembark and line up. Hearts pounded, eyes scanned for threats. Every man imagined that punishment could come at any moment. They expected shouting, anger, violence, and harsh treatment. The air was thick with fear. They were on the threshold of the unknown, ready to face the nightmare they had been building in their minds for years. At the gates, some soldiers hesitated. They looked at each other, reading fear and uncertainty in every expression. Some gripped their belongings tightly. Others tried to stand tall, pretending confidence, but the weight of expectation pressed down on them. They were on the edge of reality, expecting terror, certain that everything they had been told about Britain would soon be proven true. They were led inside, but the world they entered did not immediately match the horrors they had imagined. The buildings were quiet, the air was calm. The guards gave instructions, but not with anger or force. The atmosphere was controlled but not violent. The men could feel the tension inside themselves, a tension built over years of. And yet, despite the outward calm, the soldiers were trapped in the certainty of what they believed Britain to be. They had been told, for years, that captivity here would break them. Every warning, every story, every rumor had prepared them for suffering. They were ready for the harshest treatment. They were certain of it. They had been trained to expect it. And now, standing inside the camp, they waited. Every man held his breath. Every man prepared for the first blow, the first harsh word, the first sign of cruelty. The moment stretched. Silence seemed louder than any shout. Each prisoner felt it pressing down, a reminder of every warning, every story, every piece of propaganda. And then, without any immediate cruelty, without any punishment, the men began to realize they had crossed the threshold. They were no longer on the journey to captivity. They were inside it. The gates had closed behind them. The uncertainty of the journey was over. What came next would reveal whether the fears of years were true. And yet, as they stood in line, waiting for instructions, a small, quiet confusion began to appear. Something did not match what they had been told. But it was fleeting, pushed aside by expectation. They were trained to fear, trained to obey the certainty of propaganda. The tension remained, thick and almost unbearable. The German soldiers thought Britain would break them, and in that moment, as they faced their first British captors, they were still ready to be broken. But as the gates closed behind them, German soldiers stood in the quiet of the camp. The air was calm. The guards moved slowly, without shouting. The buildings were orderly, clean, and quiet. For a moment, nothing terrible happened. No harsh words, no immediate punishment, nothing like the horrors they had imagined for years. At first, many tried to dismiss it. They told themselves it was only a trick. Perhaps the calm was temporary. Perhaps the next moment would bring the shouting, the anger, the violence they expected. They looked at the British soldiers carefully, searching for hidden threats. Every glance, every gesture was examined. They were still afraid, but now a new feeling began to creep in: confusion. The first shock came in small ways. Guards spoke in quiet voices. Orders were given clearly, calmly, without raising their tone. Soldiers were not pushed, grabbed, or shouted at. The routine was simple: line up, be counted, follow instructions.
It was precise, but not cruel. The German prisoners did not know what to make of it. They expected hostility, but all they received was order. Food was another surprise. Meals were simple, but plentiful. Bread, soup, and vegetables were provided. No one went hungry. No one was punished for taking extra food. Soldiers who had imagined weeks of starvation could not believe the reality before them. They examined the portions, expecting traps or rations smaller than promised. But each meal was calm, straightforward, and reliable. It did not fit the stories they had carried with them for years.
The camp itself was orderly. Buildings were clean, beds were made, toilets were functional, the grounds were well kept. Soldiers were able to move around in daylight without fear. There was no shouting from above, no random violence, no cruelty in daily life. Everything was as simple as it could be. It was not paradise, but it was nothing like the nightmare they had imagined. Many prisoners began to notice the small acts of kindness that were part of everyday camp life. Guards occasionally offered water or directions. They spoke politely, sometimes even helping a soldier with a heavy load. These gestures were not loud or dramatic, but they contradicted the constant warnings that every Brit was cruel. The German soldiers were careful not to show surprise. They did not trust it, but they felt it nonetheless. Work inside the camp was organized but gentle. Prisoners were assigned tasks, but these were not dangerous. Cleaning, maintenance, or gardening became daily routines. There was discipline, but it was not punishment. Soldiers began to see that labor did not always mean suffering. Simple responsibilities became ways to pass time, and the men slowly began to adjust. Some still resisted. Diaries and letters from German prisoners described the same disbelief. One soldier wrote that he could not understand how he was alive and safe when he had expected punishment at every turn. Another noted that the guards spoke quietly and everything was in order. There was no shouting. There was no anger. It made no sense. These reflections appear again and again. The men recorded confusion and wonder, not joy or relief. It was strange to survive a situation they had expected to destroy them. Some soldiers tried to maintain the mindset of fear. They remembered the warnings, the films, and the speeches. They told each other that the calm was temporary, that the first mistake would bring punishment. They reminded themselves of the certainty that had been drilled into them. But slowly, the reality of the camp made it harder to believe. Days passed, weeks passed. The harsh expectations never arrived. The soldiers were forced to confront the difference between fear and fact. The mental shift was subtle. A soldier who expected yelling found only instructions. A man who expected cruelty found polite, careful guards. The expectations of war, drilled for years, did not match reality. Confusion turned into reflection. Some men began to question not the British, but the stories they had been told. Some soldiers noticed the kindness in subtle ways. One man observed the guard who helped another prisoner carry a heavy bucket. Another recalled how the captors treated a sick soldier without anger or impatience. None of these acts were extraordinary in the sense of heroism. They were ordinary gestures. And yet, for men expecting brutality, ordinary kindness felt shocking. It caused hesitation, questioning, and a sense of disbelief. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers had been trained to expect only cruelty and hostility. Their entire mental world had been constructed around fear. Now, confronted with calm, they had no immediate tools to understand it. Some tried to rationalize it. Some accused the guards of hiding their true intentions. Others admitted in private diaries that they simply could not make sense of it. Confusion became the dominant emotion, replacing the fear that had once controlled them. Over time, prisoners began to develop routines that resembled normal life. They cleaned, cooked, wrote letters, and spoke to each other. Each day repeated the same calm, simple structure. The longer it continued, the harder it became to cling to old expectations. Men who had feared daily violence discovered that life could continue without cruelty.
They were not happy in a dramatic sense.
The shock did not disappear quickly. Many prisoners continued to expect cruelty, especially in the first weeks. They approached every interaction with caution. They counted steps, observed movements, and waited for signs of anger. Yet, each calm day eroded the certainty of fear. Soldiers began to see patterns. The British followed rules, treated prisoners consistently, and rarely reacted with anger. Every observation contradicted the story that fear had told them for years. This transformation had deeper effects. Men who had once believed their enemy to be brutal discovered that assumptions could be wrong. They began to question other beliefs too. Some noted that propaganda had exaggerated danger. Others reflected on the difference between imagination and observation. They realized that their minds had been shaped by fear, and that experience could undo it. The psychological impact went beyond the camp. It changed the way soldiers thought about certainty, authority, and belief. Prisoners also noticed the small freedoms allowed. Walks, conversations, and even simple decisions like what to eat or where to sleep became opportunities to observe normal life. These choices were small, yet they revealed a world unlike the one they had been told to expect.
The camp also provided opportunities for reflection. Soldiers had time to write diaries, read, and talk with each other. These moments allowed them to process what they had seen. They wrote about confusion, surprise, and disbelief. They described the challenge of adjusting to a reality that did not match expectation. For some, this was deeply unsettling. For others, it was quietly enlightening. The shock was mental, subtle, and profound. Over months, the effect became clearer. Soldiers who had arrived full of fear began to think differently about Britain. They understood that the calm they experienced was not weakness or deception. It was normal human behavior. They saw that rules, order, and care could exist without cruelty. They realized that their previous beliefs had been built on exaggeration, fear, and lies. This understanding was not sudden but gradual, arriving in quiet moments of observation. The British POW system was designed for order, not punishment. Guards followed protocols, maintained routine, and treated prisoners consistently. There was no drama, no cruelty, no attempt to humiliate. For men trained to expect brutality, this simple, calm approach was disorienting. Yet it had a powerful effect. It showed that fear could be unwarranted. It showed that expectation and reality could differ completely. Some soldiers wrote that the experience changed them more than the battle itself. The shock was not in physical hardship, it was in realizing that their mind had been misled. They had carried fear for years, only to find that the reality around them was almost ordinary. The calm and kindness they experienced unmade the certainty they had believed in for so long. This was a different kind of victory, one of understanding and reflection rather than battle. By the time they were released or repatriated after the war, these men carried a memory of surprise and revelation. They remembered a Britain that had not broken them, but had unraveled the fears and assumptions inside their own minds. It was a quiet, profound lesson about the power of expectation, the subtlety of fear, and the difference between stories and reality. Looking back, the experience of the German POWs in Britain was not about suffering or punishment. It was about the mind and the ways it can be shaped by belief. Soldiers had expected cruelty and instead found calm. They had expected chaos and instead found order. They had expected fear and instead found reflection. Their captors never intended to shock them psychologically, yet that is exactly what happened. The human mind, trained to anticipate terror, had to adapt to a different reality. The quiet, simple daily life of the camp had a lasting impact. Soldiers learned that fear can be created and sustained by stories, and that reality does not always match expectation. They learned that observation, patience, and reflection could reveal truth where certainty had once ruled. The experience shaped their understanding of human behavior, belief, and the nature of fear itself. In the end, the German prisoners of war arrived in Britain expecting to be broken. They left not broken, but quietly changed. Their certainty had been replaced with observation. Their fear had been replaced with reflection. They had been misled for years by stories, propaganda, and expectation.
And through this experience, they discovered a truth more subtle and profound than any battle, that the mind can be the most dangerous battlefield, and that calm, ordinary human behavior can undo even the strongest fears.